Hey, in the last lesson we talked about congruent triangles and what it means to be congruent, and that congruent triangles will have all corresponding angles congruent and all corresponding sides congruent. So you can always tell if two triangles are congruent if you know that all three pairs of corresponding angles and all three pairs of corresponding sides are congruent. But sometimes you don't have all of that information, and so there are these things that we call sometimes shortcuts, um, ways that we don't have to know all of the information, but we can still establish that the triangles are congruent. And so we're going to talk about two of those shortcuts, or two of those methods today, the side, and side angle side method. And before we get into that, we do need to discuss a property that might be new to you. So sometimes we'll have triangles that overlap or they share a side or an angle. And when that happens, that side or angle in both triangles is going to end up being the same size. So it's a corresponding angle or a corresponding side that's congruent. So for example, in this picture, I have this big triangle RSQ, and I have a smaller triangle I'll call BSA. And they overlap here at angle S. And so angle S is in both triangles. So that means that angle S is the same in both triangles based on the reflexive property. Similarly over here, these two triangles, they share this side. And so therefore, if I were to pull those two triangles apart, they would both have that side still. And so those sides would be congruent. And so then we can say that they're congruent based on the reflexive property. So basically, the reflexive property lets us know something about a pair of triangles without it being explicitly marked. So we know that this angle is the same in both triangles, even though it wasn't marked because they overlap there. Same thing here. Even though this original side wasn't marked congruent in both triangles, we know for a fact they're congruent because they share that side, so it has to be the same size. So one shortcut that we can use to show that two triangles are congruent without knowing anything about the angles in those triangles is if we know that all three pairs of corresponding sides are congruent, then we can say those triangles are definitely congruent, and we can establish that by saying we're using the side method. Usually we'll shorten that to SSS. And so you can see here we have a side in each triangle marked with one tick mark, a side in each triangle marked with two tick marks, and then a side in each triangle marked with three tick marks. And so that establishes three pairs of corresponding congruent sides. And so then we would say those triangles are congruent by side. Another method which uses sides is the side angle side method. And so this time we only need two pairs of congruent sides. So here we have a side in each triangle with one tick mark, a side in each triangle with two. And then if we know the angle in between those sides, that's called the included angle. So the angle that those two sides are making. So if I'm going to be using these two sides in this triangle to compare to these two sides in this triangle, if the angle in each of those triangles that's being made by the sides I'm using are congruent, then I have side angle side, and I know that those two triangles are going to be congruent triangles. So here I have marked that those two angles are congruent. In each triangle, the angle that's marked congruent is between the two sides that are marked congruent. And so I have side angle side here. So let's put these methods to the test. Let's decide if the two triangles in each figure are congruent. And then if they are congruent, let's say if it's congruent by side or side angle side. So I want to start off these practice problems by saying you should always look for two special properties. One would be that reflexive property that we talked about a minute or two ago, and the other one would be uh, if you have vertical angles, because remember from a long time ago that vertical angles are always congruent. You don't need to be told that those are congruent angles. If they're vertical angles, then they're going to be congruent. So in this first picture, I have one pair of sides, so one side in each triangle that's marked with two tick marks. I have one side in each triangle marked with three tick marks. And then I also have a side that's in both triangles. That's an example of our reflexive property. So that means that this side in both triangles is the same size. So we have a third pair of congruent sides. So these two triangles are congruent by side, side, side. Over here, the triangles don't overlap at all, so I can't have the reflexive property. I'm not going to have any vertical angles. What I do have is one pair of sides that each have one tick mark, and I have one pair of angles that are congruent. But I don't know a third piece of information. So I can't have side, side, side because I only know one pair of congruent sides. I can't have side angle side because I only have one pair of congruent sides. And so therefore, we can say that these two triangles are not congruent. Let's look at these two. Here we have the reflexive property. These two triangles overlap, so they share this side. So we're going to mark those are congruent. And I'm going to put two tick marks because I see that I already have a pair of sides with one tick mark each. And then I have one pair of congruent angles. So now what we need in order to establish side angle side, I have two pairs of congruent sides. I have one pair of congruent angles. That angle has to be between the two sides I'm using. So in this triangle, my angle that's marked congruent is being made by the two sides that are marked congruent. In this triangle, my angle that's marked congruent is not being made by the two sides that are marked congruent. So even though we have two pairs of sides congruent and one pair of angles congruent, we don't have side angle side, so we're going to say they're not congruent. And to be honest, these triangles might be congruent, but we don't have enough information to say they are. In this last one, I have vertical angles here, so I can mark that that angle and that angle there are congruent. I have a pair of sides with two tick marks, and I have a pair of sides with three tick marks. And again, in this triangle, my angle that's marked is being made by the two sides that are marked. But the angle in this triangle that's marked is not being made by the two sides that marked. So again, this is a not congruent. They would be congruent, however, if, for example, my three tick marks would have been right here. Then it would have been side angle side. That angle would have been between those two. But since it's not, then it's not. So I want you to try these three. Let me number them. This is number 1, 2, 3. So try those three. Answer and the answer space provided. Either type side, 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 or select side, 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 side angle side, or not congruent. And then if you continue to watch, I will go over the answers. So this first one is side, side, side because I can mark these sides congruent because of the reflexive property, and that gives me three pairs of sides that are congruent. In this triangle, I do have vertical angles here, but I don't know anything about the sides in these triangles. I don't have any pairs of sides congruent, and so therefore we would say they're not congruent. Or at the very least, we don't have enough information to say they're congruent. And in this one, again, I have reflexive property. I'm going to put 2 tick marks because I have sides with 1 tick mark already. And the angle in this triangle marked is between the 2 sides marked. The angle in this triangle that's marked is between the 2 sides that are marked. And so that is side, angle, side. Please, if you have any questions, make sure you write them down so you remember to ask, and we can talk about them together in class.